Mr. Dodd, what do you think is the basic crux of this whole problem?
Well, Doctor, I feel that the problem itself originates with that aspect of human life which condemns men collectively to experience what is known as the fall of man. And that subsequently Christ became into the world with the knowledge that the individual could confront this condition and not become victimized by it, but that entailed the individual emulating Christ, who through the temptations in the wilderness was confronted by the satanic, listened to what the satanic had to offer, and say no, and then add, and I know you to be Satan, and Satan went away. That to me is the clue to how to nullify this influence which has had humanity in its grip for centuries. Well, of course, what it means is that one has to accept the realism of the inclusion of evil, and that in turn challenges the world of education to equip the student with the knowledge necessary to recognize evil in action within the sphere of his own experiences and refuse to be part of it. Then this influence, which has been behind the creation of this network, can't operate. It cannot operate in the light. And admittedly, it says that it acknowledges that, so that it is, those who are part of it knowingly are scared to death that somebody at some point, as they put it, is going to pick up the end of a string and little by little follow it to the end. And as they put it to me, when that happens, we're through.
27 years ago, the Congress of the United States authorized the formation of a congressional investigating committee to try to analyze the functions of the great foundations in America, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Mr. Norman Dodd was the director of research for the congressional committee that came to be known as the Reese Committee. Mr. Dodd is an economist. He's a consultant as far as investment is concerned. But during that period, that very important period, some 27 years ago, he headed research in the effort to find out what indeed were the great foundations doing in America. Mr. Dodd, what did you find out was the stated objective and goals of the great American foundations?
We found out, Doctor, that these foundations had as their objective the orientation of the people of this country to the idea of collectivism, and thereby nullifying for good and all of the commitment of the country to individualism, which was the feature of the country at the beginning.
Now, how did they go about doing this?
Well, primarily they did it, Doctor, by securing control of what is known as the money supply of the people of this country.
You're speaking now of the money supply that was going into education.
Well, it's the money supply of the people of the country as a whole.
And how did they do this?
They did this by working out a system of banking, which was foreign in its concept, but it enabled debt to be what we call monetized, transformed into bank deposits.
Now, how did they specifically set out to influence education in America?
Well, by having at their disposal unlimited quantities of this newly created money and being able to reward the personalities who are active in the world of education, administratively as well as academically.
Were they able to influence the textbooks or the teachers?
Yes, they were. They were able to see that textbooks were almost produced on order, and assuring the publishers of textbooks of the funds necessary to make publication of those books profitable.
That was the capacity of what they call Director of Research for the Reese Committee.
Can you tell us what the Reese Committee was attempting to do?
Yes, I can tell you. It was operating and carrying out instructions embodied in a resolution passed by the House of Representatives, which was to investigate the activities of foundations as to whether or not these activities could justifiably be labeled un-American, without, I might say, defining what they meant by un-American. But that was the resolution, and the committee had then the task of selecting a council, and the council in turn had the task of selecting a staff, and he had to have somebody who would direct the work of that staff, and that was what they meant by the Director of Research.
What were some of the details, the specifics that you told the committee at that time?
Well, Mr. Griffin, in that report, I specifically, number one, defined what was, to us, what was meant by the phrase un-American. And we defined that in our way as being a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means. We have plenty of constitutional procedures, assuming that we wish to effect a change in the form of government or that sort of thing. And therefore, any effort in that direction which did not avail itself of the procedures which were authorized by the Constitution could be justifiably called un-American. That was the start of educating them up to that particular point. The next thing was to educate them as to the effect on the country as a whole of the activities of large endowed foundations over the then past 40 years.
What was that effect, sir?
That effect was to orient our educational system away from support of the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence and implemented in the Constitution, and educated them over to the idea that the task now was, as a result of the orientation of education, to away from these briefly stated principles and self-evident truths. And that's what had been the effect of the wealth which constituted the endowments of those foundations that had been in existence over the largest portion of the span of 50 years, and holding them responsible for this change. And what we were able to bring forward was that what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education, which they discuss throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. Then finally, they answer that question as follows: we must control the State Department. And they answer it by saying, we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. Dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach four of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency. Yeah, I might tell you this experience, as far as its impact on Catherine Casey was concerned, was she never was able to return to her law practice. If it hadn't been for Carol Reese's ability to tuck her away on a job with the Federal Trade Commission, I don't know what would have happened to Catherine, but ultimately she lost her mind as a result of it.
Because it's only in the light of that policy that these events and effects make any sense. And this is how, and this is their problem, Doctor. They cannot avoid having effects result from the grants that they make. They cannot avoid it. Therefore, those in this country who would be concerned with what are they up to merely has to look at the effects and work back and compare the effects of a grant with the explanation of the grant in the first place. I mean, I'll just use as an instance that clarify the matter. You will remember there was a time when the Federal Reserve System was installed in this country by the Congress. In other words, it was legalized. And it had been preceded by a long period of years and a struggle to get the Federal Reserve approved. Finally, it was approved, and the argument that swung the approval in that direction was that if the system is installed, the result will be the elimination of bank failures. And inasmuch as there had been in those days a plethora of bank failures, this was held up as a very beneficial development, practice, what they call fractional reserve central banking. But nobody goes back, this was in 1912, nobody goes back to 1930 when every bank in the United States was closed. Every bank. There wasn't a solvent bank in the United States. That, you see, was proof that the original purpose was in no sense to eliminate bank failures. And this discrepancy and these contrasts and these contradictions are the telltale part that those who have imposed these practices on us as a people are scared to death that it's going to be picked up and stressed and taught and so forth and so on. One accredited educational institution with trustees who openly declared that we noticed this. We noticed the inconsistency, the contradictions, and we are setting forth an effort to account for them. And that, in my opinion, would explode the whole network. And they have told me that this is what they're scared to death. Somebody is going to pick up this string.